The waitress didn't react when the first shot was fired, and the Korean Mafia boss watching from the back realized she was the one who used to give the orders. The neon sign hummed with a low, dying buzz that sounded like a warning no one was heeding. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt grease and old rain. It was the kind of 3:00 a.m. crowd that didn't want to be noticed. A weary night shift mechanic, a woman staring at a cold plate of eggs, and a man in a sharp, dark suit whose presence felt like a blade in a room full of plastic spoons. Raven Cole was leaning against the counter, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, when the door didn't just open, it shattered the silence. A man in a black tactical mask stepped in, the smell of wet pavement clinging to his jacket, and fired a round into the ceiling. The mechanic dived for the floor. The woman screamed, her plate shattering as she scrambled for the booths, but Raven didn't move. She didn't drop the mug and she didn't lower her gaze. She simply turned her head toward the gunman with a look so steady, so devoid of fear, it felt like a challenge. In the back booth, Min-sik Park didn't look at the robber. He looked at the waitress. He watched the way she calculated the distance between herself and the shooter, not like a victim looking for an exit, but like a general looking for a flaw. The way she held her ground wasn't bravery, it was muscle memory. He had seen that stillness once before, years ago, in a world where blood was the only currency. He didn't just recognize her face, he recognized the authority in her silence. The ghost hadn't just disappeared. She had been hiding in plain sight, pouring coffee for men who had no idea they were in the presence of a queen. By the time the sun began to bleed through the smog of the city skyline, the video had already bypassed the local news cycles and entered the darker veins of the internet. It was a grainy, high-angle shot from the diner's security feed, uploaded by a witness who had been trembling too hard to capture anything but the waitress's silhouette. The footage was silent, but the image spoke with a deafening roar. There was Raven, framed by the red and white neon of the diner, standing as still as a statue while a man held a firearm to her temple. The clip was only 12 seconds long. It showed the gunman shouting, his body a frantic mess of jagged movements, and then it showed Raven. She didn't look like a woman facing death. She looked like a woman bored by the interruption. When the first shot hit the ceiling, she didn't duck. She merely shifted her weight, her eyes tracking the gunman with a cold, predatory focus that suggested she was already 3 moves ahead of his next breath. In a penthouse 30 floors above the city's financial district, Min-sik Park watched the clip on a loop. The blue light of the tablet reflected in his dark eyes, casting sharp shadows across his face. He didn't need the audio. He remembered the way she had looked at him 7 years ago, across a different table in a different life, when she had been the ghost, the tactical shadow whose whispers moved entire syndicates like chess pieces. Seeing her now, wearing a polyester uniform and a name tag, felt like watching a fallen goddess tending a shrine of dirt. But Min-sik wasn't the only one watching. Deep in the industrial outskirts, inside a warehouse that smelled of damp concrete and ozone, a man known only as Silas paused the video at the 6th second. He leaned closer to the monitor, his thumb tracing the line of Raven's jaw on the screen. He knew that stillness. He had been the one to try and break it years ago, back when she had vanished and left a vacuum of power that had nearly swallowed them all. "The ghost has finally stopped running," Silas murmured, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the hum of the servers. Within hours, the digital footprint of the video had been tracked to a specific street corner in the Lower East Side. The Underworld, which had spent nearly a decade mourning or cursing her disappearance, began to stir. To the public, she was the stoic waitress, a viral sensation and a symbol of modern bravery. To the men who lived in the shadows, she was a beacon. The silence she had carefully cultivated for 7 years had been shattered by a single, desperate robber with a shaking hand. Raven Cole was no longer invisible. She was a target. The fluorescent lights of the manager's office flickered with a rhythmic, sickly click that felt like a countdown. Raven stood on the other side of the desk, her apron already folded neatly over her arm. The scent of the diner, the stale grease, the industrial cleaner, the lingering ozone from the gunshot, clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing she couldn't wait to shed. Her manager, Lou, wouldn't look at her. He was a man who lived his life in the margins, keeping his books balanced and his head down, especially when it came to the off-the-menu gambling rings that operated in the back booths during the graveyard shift. He tapped a nervous rhythm on a stack of envelopes, his eyes fixed on the small television in the corner, where the morning news was playing the security footage of Raven's defiance for the 10th time that hour. "I can't have it, Raven," Lou finally said, his voice thin and strained. "The cops have been here 3 times, the health inspector called. Even the guys from the social club are asking questions about why my waitress looks like she's auditioning for an action movie." "I did my job, Lou," Raven said, her voice a flat, calm line. "I protected your register and your customers." "That's the problem," Lou countered, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were wide with a fear she hadn't seen in the gunman. "Normal people scream. Normal people hide. You looked like you were waiting for him to pull the trigger just so you could show him how little it mattered. People are calling you a hero, but heroes are magnets for trouble. And I have too much to hide to have a magnet behind my counter." He slid a final paycheck across the scarred wood of the desk. It was light, barely covering her rent for the month, let alone the extra expenses for Elijah's school. "You're a good worker, Raven, maybe the best I've had, but you're not a waitress, not really. I don't know what you are, but you're too loud for a quiet place like this." Raven didn't argue. She knew the logic of the shadows better than Lou did. When you're trying to disappear, being remarkable is a death sentence. She picked up the check, her fingers steady despite the cold weight settling in her chest. As she walked out the back door, the midday sun hit her with a harsh, unforgiving glare. She was 28 years old, a former commander of a world that didn't exist on maps, and now she was unemployed because she had forgotten how to pretend to be afraid. She pulled her jacket tight against the biting wind. Her mind already pivoting to Elijah. She had promised him safety, and now she had brought the entire world's gaze to their doorstep. The silence she had spent 7 years building was gone, replaced by the rising hum of a past that was no longer content to stay buried. The stairs of the walk-up apartment building groaned under the weight of a presence that didn't belong there. Raven heard the footsteps before she saw the man. They weren't the erratic, heavy thuds of her neighbors or the frantic scuffle of the street kids. They were measured, rhythmic, and heavy, with the kind of certainty that only comes from owning the ground you walk on. Raven was sitting at the small kitchen table, a single lamp casting a warm, orange circle over a stack of unpaid bills and Elijah's drawings. She didn't reach for a weapon, though her hand brushed the edge of the table where a steak knife was hidden in the underside of the wood. When the knock came, 3 precise raps, she stood and opened the door just wide enough to see the man in the $10,000 suit standing in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. Minsick Park didn't look like a threat in the traditional sense. He looked like an inevitability. "The coffee at the diner was terrible," he said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the narrow space. "But your composure was excellent. It's a rare thing to see a ghost in a red and white uniform." Raven didn't flinch at the name. "The ghost is dead, Mr. Park. She died 7 years ago in a shipping yard in Incheon. I'm just a woman who needs to find a new job." "You were never just a woman, Raven. You were a strategist. You were the one who told the kings where to move their pieces." Minsick leaned slightly against the doorframe, his eyes scanning the modest apartment, lingering for a second on the closed door to Elijah's bedroom. "And now, the kings have seen you on the morning news. Silas has seen you. The piece you've built is a house of glass, and someone just threw a brick." "Is that a threat?" Raven asked, her voice dropping into that flat, dangerous register that had paralyzed the gunman. "It is a diagnostic," Minsick corrected. "I'm opening a new establishment. Jan. It requires a specific kind of management, not a waitress but a consultant. Someone who knows how to see a threat before it enters the room. Someone who knows how to command a territory without firing a single shot." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored card. On it was a single address and a time. "I'm not looking for a savior," Raven said, her fingers tightening on the door handle. "I'm not offering salvation," Minsick replied, turning to head back down the stairs. I'm offering a fortress for you and for the boy. If you stay here, they will find you by tomorrow night. If you come to me, you can start giving the orders again." He disappeared into the shadows of the stairwell, leaving only the scent of expensive sandalwood and the cold realization that the quiet life Raven had bled for was finally, irrevocably over. The heavy glass doors of Jan didn't just open. They hissed, sealing the chaos of the city behind Raven as she stepped into a world of curated silence and lethal elegance. The restaurant was a cathedral of dark marble and amber light, a stark contrast to the grease-stained walls of the diner she had left behind. Minsik Park was waiting for her at a central table, a bottle of vintage scotch between them that likely cost more than Raven's last 3 months of rent. He didn't stand. He simply gestured to the seat opposite him. "You're punctual, a habit of the military or a habit of a woman who knows time is running out." Raven didn't sit immediately. She walked the perimeter of the room first, her eyes scanning the blind spots, the kitchen exits, and the placement of the security cameras. She moved with a liquid grace that made the 2 guards by the door shift uncomfortably. They saw a waitress. Minsik saw a predator measuring the cage. "I'm here for the fortress, not the scotch," Raven said, finally taking the seat. She didn't lean back. Her spine was a straight line, her hands resting flat on the table, the same way they had been when the gunman held a weapon to her head. "But if I'm going to run this floor, we need to be clear about who I am and who I am not." Minsik poured a single glass, pushing it toward her. "And who are you, Raven?" "I am a consultant. I am the eyes of this establishment. I will identify every threat before it crosses the threshold, and I will neutralize the ones that do." "But I am not your soldier," she said, her voice dropping into a low, vibrating register. "I don't pull triggers for your vendettas, and I don't move your product. I protect this space, and in exchange, you protect my brother. You provide him with the security detail I can't afford, and you ensure that when Silas's men come looking, and they will, this building is the last thing they ever see." Minsik watched her for a long beat, the ice clinking softly in his glass. "You're asking for a lot of resources for someone who refuses to carry a gun." "I don't need a gun to end a man, Minsik. You know that better than anyone," Raven replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cream-colored card he had given her, sliding it back across the marble. "If I find a single one of your men near Elijah without my permission, or if you try to use me as a pawn in a war I've already won, I'll vanish again. And this time, I'll make sure there's nothing left of your empire to recognize." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Minsik's face, a look of genuine respect. He held up his glass in a silent toast. "Welcome back to the world of the living, Commander. Your terms are accepted." Raven didn't drink. She stood up, adjusted the collar of her jacket, and looked toward the entrance. "The man in the gray sedan across the street has been watching the door for 20 minutes. Send someone to move him. The piece starts now." The first real test of Jan's fragile peace arrived on a Friday night, carried on the breath of 3 men who smelled of expensive cologne and cheap adrenaline. They weren't there to eat. They were there to send a message. They pushed past the maitre d' with the practiced arrogance of those who believed the city's laws didn't apply to them, heading straight for the private lounge where Minsik was hosting a delicate negotiation with a local developer. Raven was standing by the wine cellar, her eyes already tracking their gait. She didn't call for the security detail. She didn't reach for the radio on her belt. Instead, she adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse and began to move, her trajectory a perfect intercept. She met them in the center of the dining room, a neutral ground where the ambient jazz and the clinking of silverware provided a mask for the tension. "The lounge is private this evening, gentlemen," Raven said. Her voice was low, carrying that same flat, unbreakable certainty that had unnerved the gunman at the diner. "I can offer you a table by the window, or I can offer you the exit. You have 5 seconds to choose." The leader, a man with a scarred lip and eyes that had seen too much television, laughed. He reached out as if to brush her aside. "Get out of the way, sweetheart. We have business with Park." He didn't see her move. To the patrons, it looked like a dance. Raven didn't strike him. She simply stepped into his personal space, her hand catching his wrist in a way that looked like a polite gesture but felt like a vice. She applied a fractional amount of pressure to a nerve cluster she knew by heart. The man's knees buckled, his face draining of color as his breath hitched. "Your center of gravity is off," Raven whispered, leaning close enough that only he could hear. "And your backup is currently being watched by two men in the rafters who are much better shots than you are. If you take another step toward that lounge, you won't just fail your boss, you'll be an example." She released him as quickly as she had caught him. The silence she projected was more terrifying than a shout. It was the silence of a woman who knew exactly how many seconds it would take to dismantle the room. The man's companions hesitated, their hands hovering near their jackets. They looked at Raven, searching for the fear that usually greeted them. They found nothing but a cold, tactical vacuum. "The window," the leader managed, his voice cracking. "We'll take the table by the window." "Excellent choice," Raven said, her expression smoothing into a professional mask. "The view is much better when you're still breathing." From the shadows of the lounge doorway, Minsik watched the entire exchange. He didn't intervene. He didn't have to. He saw the way Raven returned to her post, her pulse steady, her eyes already scanning the next set of doors. She wasn't just managing a floor, she was holding a border. And for the first time in 7 years, the ghost looked like she was home. The sanctuary of the apartment felt thinner than usual that night. Raven sat in the darkness of the living room, her chair positioned at an angle that allowed her to see the front door and the hallway leading to Elijah's room without being visible from the windows. The city hummed outside, a distant roar of engines and sirens, but inside the air was heavy, expectant. She heard the floorboard in the hallway creak. It was a sound so faint most would have dismissed it as the building settling, but Raven's muscles coiled like a spring. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative step of Minsik or the light, careless trot of her brother. It was a ghost's footfall, weightless, practiced, and familiar. Then came the sound of the latch, a metallic click-slide as a thin strip of steel bypassed the deadbolt she had installed herself. The door swung open an inch, letting in a sliver of the hallway's sickly yellow light. "You always did have a talent for choosing the worst locks, Raven," a voice drifted into the room. It was smooth, like oil over water, carrying a jagged edge of malice that made the hair on her arms stand up. Silas stepped into the room. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a shadow given human form, dressed in a tactical jacket that muffled his movements. He didn't rush her. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands visible and empty, yet he radiated the energy of a predator that had already won. 7 years, Silas murmured, his eyes scanning the room with a look of profound disappointment. 7 years of hiding in grease traps and walk-ups just to end up working for a man like Park. You've let yourself grow small, Commander. You've let the world convince you that you're a victim. Raven didn't move. She didn't reach for the knife she had taped to the underside of the chair. Her heart was a steady hammer in her chest, but her voice remained like ice. "I didn't grow small, Silas. I grew quiet." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Silas took a step forward, the light catching the scar that ran from his ear to his jaw, a gift she had given him during her escape. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a woman waiting for permission to breathe. The board wants their ghost back. They want the woman who can move mountains with a whisper. And if I have to burn this building down with that boy inside to get her to wake up, I will." For the first time since the robbery, Raven felt the mask slip. A cold, black rage flared in her gut, not for herself, but for the threat to Elijah. She stood up, her movement so sudden and fluid that Silas actually took a half step back, his hand darting toward his waistband. "If you touch him," Raven said, her voice a low, vibrating snarl that filled the small room, "you won't live long enough to regret it. I'm not the ghost anymore, Silas. I'm something much worse. I'm a woman with something to lose." Silas stared at her, a slow, twisted grin spreading across his face. "There she is. I was starting to worry you forgot." He backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tomorrow night, Raven, at the docks. Come home or I'll bring the war to your doorstep." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone in the dark. Raven didn't sit back down. She walked to Elijah's door, listening to his steady breathing, and realized the peace was truly over. It was time to stop hiding and start hunting. The silence following Silas's departure was louder than his threats. Raven stood in the center of her kitchen, the orange light of the lamp casting a long, jagged shadow against the wall. For 7 years, she had convinced herself that this shadow was a stranger, a violent, cold-blooded ghost she had successfully exorcised. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, the woman staring back wasn't the tired waitress who worried about rent. It was the commander who had once looked at a map of a city and seen only targets. A tremor started in her hands, the first sign of weakness she had allowed since the day she left Korea. It wasn't fear of Sila's, it was fear of the person she had to become to stop him. The bedroom door creaked open and Elijah stood there, rubbing his eyes, his oversized t-shirt hanging off his thin frame. "Raven, is someone here? I thought I heard talking." Raven immediately turned, her posture softening in an instant, though the transition felt like pulling teeth. "Just the pipes, Elle. Go back to sleep." "You look different," he murmured, squinting at her, "like you're looking through the walls again." "I'm just tired," she lied, her heart aching at the ease of the deception. "Go on, I'll be there in a minute." When he closed the door, Raven walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. She leaned heavily against the porcelain sink, staring into the mirror until her vision blurred. For years, she had tried to be small, to be the woman who flinched at loud noises, the woman who looked down when men yelled, the woman who took the path of least resistance. She had thought that by suppressing her strength, she was protecting Elijah. She had mistaken her trauma for a transformation, but Sila's had seen through it. Lou had seen through it. Even the gunman at the diner had sensed the vacuum where her fear should have been. She realized then that the mirror hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. The small version of Raven Cole was a lie she could no longer afford to tell. To keep Elijah safe, she couldn't be the victim who ran. She had to be the ghost who hunted. She reached into the back of the medicine cabinet, pulling aside a false panel to reveal a small, encrypted burner phone she hadn't touched in half a decade. As the screen flickered to life, the blue light erased the waitress and sharpened the edges of the commander. She wasn't reclaiming her past, she was weaponizing it. She dialed a number she had burned into her memory, her voice no longer flat, but edged with the cold, sharp precision of a blade being drawn. "Min-sik," she said when the line picked up. "The piece is over. I need a clean car and a secure location for my brother. Now." The safe house was a concrete shell overlooking the harbor, smelling of salt spray and old secrets. Elijah was asleep in the back room under the watchful eye of Min-sik's most trusted lieutenant, leaving Raven and the Mafia boss alone in a room lit only by the rhythmic sweep of a lighthouse beam. Raven stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the glass. She held the burner phone in her hand like a grenade. "Why are you doing this, Min-sik? This isn't just about a consultant. You're risking a war with the board for a waitress who didn't flinch. No businessman is that reckless." Min-sik stepped out of the shadows, the light catching the silver at his temples. He didn't look like the king of a criminal empire. He looked like a man settling a long overdue account. "You think I recognized you because of a viral video, Raven. I recognized you because I've spent 7 years looking for the woman who saved my life without ever knowing my name." Raven turned, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know you." "Not as I am now," Min-sik said, his voice dropping into a rough, low register. "But 7 years ago, I was a foot soldier in Incheon. I was the one sent to the shipping yards to clean up the mess after the ghost vanished. I was 24, bleeding out from a gut wound, left behind by a crew that didn't want to carry a corpse." He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the concrete. "I crawled into an alley waiting for the dark to take me, and then I heard a voice. It wasn't soft and it wasn't kind. It was a command. A woman told me that if I wanted to die, I should do it somewhere that didn't block her exit. She threw a field kit at my chest and told me how to stitch the wound. She didn't stay to hold my hand. She gave me the tools to survive and the order to keep moving." Raven's breath hitched. The memory flickered in the back of her mind. A rainy night, the smell of iron and sea salt, and a dying boy she hadn't had the heart to finish off. "You were that boy," she whispered. "I survived because of that order," Min-sik said. "I built my world on the strength you left in that alley. When I saw you in that diner, I didn't see a waitress. I saw the commander who reminded me that power isn't about the gun you hold but the voice you use. I don't want a soldier, Raven. I'm paying a debt. I'm giving the ghost back her throne because the world is a darker place without her in it. Raven looked at him, the wall she had built around her heart finally showing a hairline fracture. She wasn't a girl being rescued. She was a leader being reminded of her own shadow. She straightened her shoulders, the cold, tactical light returning to her eyes. "Then stop calling me the ghost," she said, her voice reclaiming its old authority. "Tell your men to prep the cars. If we're going to the docks, we're going as a fleet." The fog at the docks was thick enough to swallow the sound of the ocean, but it couldn't dampen the click of Raven's heels against the wet asphalt. She walked alone, a dark silhouette against the skeletal cranes and rusted shipping containers. Behind her, hidden in the mist, Min-6's fleet waited in a silent, lethal semicircle, not as her masters but as her shadow. Silas stood under a flickering floodlight, flanked by 4 men whose hands were tucked inside their heavy coats. When he saw Raven, he let out a short, dry laugh. "You actually came, and you didn't even bring a gun. Always so arrogant, Raven. Or maybe you've just forgotten how this world works." Raven stopped 10 feet away. She didn't look at the men with the guns. She looked directly into Silas's eyes, her expression as unreadable as the sea behind her. "I didn't forget, Silas. I just stopped caring about the tools you use to feel powerful." "The board wants their ghost," Silas said, stepping forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "They want the woman who can dismantle a rival's network in a weekend. They don't care if you're happy. They don't care about your brother. You belong to the game." "I don't belong to anything," Raven said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an edge that made the men behind Silas shift their weight. It was the voice of the commander, the one that had navigated wars before Silas even knew how to pull a trigger. "For 7 years, I thought I was hiding because I was afraid of what I had been. But tonight, I realized I was hiding because I was afraid of what I'm capable of when someone threatens what I love." She took a single step forward, and for the first time, Silas's smirk faltered. The air around her seemed to grow cold, heavy with the weight of her presence. "Go back to the board," Raven commanded. "Tell them the ghost is dead. Tell them she was replaced by a woman who has nothing left to hide and everything to protect. If you ever come near me, my brother, or this city again, I won't just disappear. I will come for every single one of you, and you know better than anyone that you won't hear me coming." Silas stared at her, searching for the crack, the moment of hesitation he had used to control her years ago. He found only a wall of steel. He looked past her at the dark sedans idling in the fog, the silent army Min-6 had provided. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at a queen who had finally decided to pick up her crown. Without a word, Silas signaled his men. They retreated into the darkness, the sound of their footsteps fading into the fog. Raven didn't turn around until the last taillight vanished. She looked up at the sky, the rain beginning to fall softly against her face. Min-6 approached her, stopping at a respectful distance. "Where to now, Commander?" he asked softly. Raven looked toward the city where Elijah was safe and the morning was waiting. She wasn't the ghost, and she wasn't just a waitress. She was Raven Cole, and for the first time in her life, the future was hers to write. "Home," she said. "Let's go home."